Hello everybody. Welcome to another Hoot episode. Speed your Istio development environment with virtual clusters. Do you have concerns with cost, CPU, and networking for your Kubernetes cluster? What is a cluster within a cluster? In this live stream, Fabian and Rich from Loft Lab, along with Antonio from solo.io, will join me to discuss what, why, and when to use vCluster and live demo how to speed up your Istio or could be some other development environment with vCluster to ease your concerns on cost, CPU, and networking. With that, I'd like to have our speaker introduced. Why don't we start with you, Fabian?
Hey Lin, hey everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm Fabian. I'm one of the co-founders of Loft Labs, which is essentially the company behind vCluster. I'm also the initiator and currently a core contributor of vCluster. And yeah, we are very happy here to present a little bit about why we think virtual clusters might be the future in the multi-tenancy for Kubernetes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Fabian. Rich, can you introduce yourself too?
Yeah, I'm Rich Burrows. I'm a staff developer advocate at Loft Labs. I work with Fabian there. I've been working with vCluster for a little bit over a year now. It's super exciting. I've been very happy to see more folks getting interested in it. Hey, Marino. I've been before working as a developer advocate, I was in infrastructure myself. So I had many roles over the years, infrastructure engineer, doing config management, SRE, all kinds of stuff. So I've felt the pain that the users feel, right? So I think that vCluster really helps with some things.
That's awesome. Great to have you. Hey, Marino, if you're audience watching us, please come by, say hi to us in the chat. We really love to hear from you, even if it's just a hi. And obviously, we love to hear your questions as well. With that, Antonio, can you introduce yourself?
Well, hi, I'm Antonio. I'm from Spain, but I'm actually living in Slovakia. I'm working as a field engineer for Solo, and that implies that on my daily basis, I'm facing a constant change into the environments to try out things and to be able to replicate what our users they are facing when they are using our products. That is related to Istio, and that, well, since I'm coming from the development side, my story starts from a Java developer, moving to DevOps, moving to architectural role, and then finally field engineer. I'm very focused on what is the developer experience. It's really important to me to be able to replicate things in my local environment. That is why I started with vCluster, and I fall in love. I use it in my daily basis, and well, then later in the demo, I will show you. I hope that you enjoy.
Awesome. Thank you to all of you. I am so excited. Sounds like we have the right speaker lined up for today's learning. With that, before we start the episode, I'd like to briefly talk about the news for this week. So bear with me on that. So the first news I want to share is Cilium has announced 1.12 GA with Cilium Service Mesh. So congratulations to the Cilium team. One thing I do want to point out in the blog, there was something that was a little bit confusing to people who have Istio background. I know my coworker, John Howard from Google, who is also a fellow TOC member, have been questioning about some of the statements in this blog regarding the Gateway API. By the way, John is a co-lead on the Gateway API for the Mesh initiative, which we talked about with the news from last week. That the Gateway API is not going to help Cilium Service Mesh data plane compatible with Service Mesh as Istio. So as far as we know, this is not entirely accurate on this highlighted points. The other thing I want to highlight is one thing interesting is Istio is the existing service mesh control plane that's supported by Cilium service mesh. It does require to run with the sidecar-based approach with Istio. The sidecar that's free data path to Istio is potentially in the future, but based on interest. So it's not something that has been done because there was a lot of confusing on Twitter and people thought this might already be implemented. So the answer is no. The other thing
hey Lynn, I
Go
actually
ahead.
know something
Yeah.
about this. So I host a podcast called Cube Cuddle, and I had Liz Rice on, and we talked about this. There was a listener question about it, and yeah, that was basically her take, is that, you know, they would pursue potentially doing the sidecarless thing for Istio, depending on the demand from the community, or if people from the community were willing to contribute, you know, and help make it work. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So just to clarify for our audience, the other thing I want to clarify for the audience, which I thought John Howard also asked a good question, is with Cilium. So there's a statement about with Cilium Service Mesh, you have both options available in your platform and can even run a mix of the two. So we're still trying to understand from the Cilium team, how do you run the mix of the two? To our knowledge, is not going to be easily implemented. So we're trying to get a little bit more clarification on that. One last thing I want to share. I did publish a blog on Cilium Layer 7 capabilities compared with Istio in different categories. So if you're interested in Layer 7 policies and a comparison between Cilium and Istio, definitely check my blog out on CNCF. So that's the news of the week. With that, let's turn our attention to virtual cluster and how does it help? So I would like to ask the Loft team, what exactly is virtual cluster? I assume vCluster stands for virtual cluster. Is it free? Okay, it does. And what license is vCluster for folks looking into using vCluster?
Yeah, it is free. It's the Apache 2.0 license, and it is on GitHub. It's it's loft-sh/vCluster. So if you go, there's actually a page that we have, vCluster.com, and if you go there, there are links to the docs and the GitHub and all of that.
Okay, is this the right page?
No, it's not. It's just vCluster.com.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Maybe you preferred me to share the screen with the diagram?
Yeah, maybe you have more experience navigate this system. Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead, share.
Yeah.
Sorry, I heard you said lofted.com. I just went there.
Yeah, no, it's okay. It's if folks, you know, want more information, if you go to vCluster.com, it's got a link to the GitHub and the docs and all of that. But yeah, the virtual clusters, basically it's a way to help with multi-tenancy pain. Think of it as having a namespace on a shared host cluster that's got a separate control plane inside of it. So it's got a Kubernetes API inside of it and some other tools. And when you connect to that, the one running inside the namespace, that looks as if it's a full-blown cluster. So it allows developers and people to have admin access and do some extra things that they wouldn't be able to do just inside of a namespace.
Interesting. So can I interpret that each namespace, each virtual cluster kind of have its own API server, so it can have its own like tenancy inside of the virtual cluster?
That's right.
Okay, cool. Antonio, you might want to enlarge that picture if you could.
Yes, I have it here open.
Yep.
Yeah,
Perfect.
and so the way, Fabian, do you want to maybe just give a high-level explanation of how it works?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, like Rich mentioned already, what vClusters is doing is essentially spinning up a small small Kubernetes cluster. By default, it's K3s inside a namespace, and that small Kubernetes cluster essentially does not have any like connected nodes or any network plugin or anything inside it. It's just like the control plane. So it's just the API server, the controller manager, the scheduler, the data backend in K3s. They are actually using SQLite. And then we have like a small component, which is here outlined as the syncer, which essentially provides, as a form of like being a hypervisor, the workload and networking capabilities of a real Kubernetes cluster. So it connects the pure virtual Kubernetes cluster to the actual worker nodes and networking of the host cluster. And it does this by essentially synchronizing resources, so lower level resources like pods, services, secrets, and so on, into the host cluster in a single namespace. So essentially, you can install like full-blown operators such as Istio or like Cert Manager, any ingress controller, monitoring solutions inside now just like a single namespace essentially, since the vCluster is living and ensures that every workload it creates is only created in a single namespace of the host cluster. So in other words, you can essentially say you expand the capabilities of a Kubernetes namespace to allow things like CRDs, cluster roles, separate namespaces in namespaces essentially, and many more that you wouldn't be able, like Rich said, to do in a regular namespace.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, in terms of like multi-tenancy, you know, in the past, I think there have been at least a couple of big models that have been in use, you know, and one of them has been the namespace isolation. And, you know, like Fabian said, some of the problems with that are that, you know, people need to suddenly start making exceptions and stuff if you want to use multiple namespaces. It's you can't manage global objects like CRDs. And so, you know, namespace isolation is kind of painful because a lot of times you end up with the platform team having to get more involved because they're the ones who can, you know, administer those global objects and things. Mm-hmm. And then the other option is kind of like every tenant gets their own cluster, right? And that's obviously really expensive and really kind of a management headache because a lot of times the platform teams have to manage the shared resources inside of those, like ingresses and things. And so suddenly, instead of 10 clusters, maybe you've got 1,000 or more that you've got to manage somehow. So this sort of makes the host cluster, the shared host cluster namespace isolation model work so it feels like every tenant has their own cluster.
Yeah, makes sense. So if I can try to answer why virtual cluster based on what you guys were just mentioning. So I guess one of the why is if the namespace isolation is not sufficient for use purpose. And the second why is the cost, right? To save me from spinning up 10 cluster, I could have a large cluster with 10 virtual cluster inside of it, which should cost a lot less. What are the other whys, do you think? Oh, am I getting this correct?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think the other big one is just that it's really fast and easy, right? Mm. So say that you're using EKS, you know, and you want to provision a new cluster. I think they've sped it up some, but it's still really slow, right? It takes like many minutes to get a new cluster. It takes seconds to spin up a vCluster. And because they are like really ephemeral and really fast and easy to like create and destroy, it means that you can use sort of different patterns. You can think of it more as like dynamic ephemeral infrastructure instead of like, I have this one cluster and I have to keep it always working. And, you know, if something goes wrong with it, I need to spend hours troubleshooting it and all of that kind of stuff. You can let go a lot of that. And it really kind of functions more like, probably more like Kind or something like that, you know, which is another thing that people use for some of the use cases, the same use cases.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so I guess as an audience, if I'm convinced this is something I'm interested to try, how do I get started with learning vClusters?
I think definitely go into vCluster.com. So I don't know if somebody can type that in the chat. I don't think I'm able to.
Yeah, let me do that.
But there's a bunch of info there. Like I said, there's a link to the GitHub repo. There's a link to the docs. I think the docs are pretty good. There's a getting started kind of quick start doc there, and it's really easy to do. It's a Go binary. You know, you download it, install it on your system. You have to have a kube context pointing towards the host cluster that you want to use, but that could be just about anything, right? That could be a local Minikube or Docker desktop. There's lots of different things that you could use for that, or it could be an EKS or a GKE cluster, you know, depending on what you're doing. Like maybe you want to have something more like the production environment that you operate in, you know, or maybe you've been given access to a shared cluster and you want to run a vCluster inside of it. But in terms of like the basics, like how to fire up a vCluster for the first time, it's really, really easy to do.
Yeah, like Rich said, it's essentially just downloading a binary, running a single command, and then you have a new virtual cluster up and running, which should work also in every Kubernetes cluster. So essentially, as long as the Kubernetes is somewhat like a certified distribution of Kubernetes, vCluster will work with it. You don't need elevated permissions as well. So even if you're only able to access like a namespace in a shared Kubernetes cluster, and you need somehow the capability of installing an operator, you also can install it there, since it's not requiring you to like change any low-level things on nodes directly. It's rather just like deploying a small Kubernetes control plane and then connects to that for every other Kubernetes request.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
like it shows. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lin.
I was just going to say, assuming you are namespace admin, right? I assume you still require privilege to that. You are the admin for your namespace, then you can deploy a vCluster to your namespace.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Go ahead, Rich. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, so like it shows in the diagram, that sort of like outline of a person in the lower left. What you do as a user is you have a kube context for the virtual cluster. And so when you're using kubectl or Helm or any other tools that interact with the API server, you just use that kube context from the virtual cluster. And in fact, when you create the virtual cluster, it actually, you know, creates a kubeconfig file like on your file system that you can use to connect.
Yeah, makes sense. Actually, I have one more question before we get to the demo. I know the audience probably wants to see a demo now. So I've been using K3S myself. So educate me, how is virtual cluster different than I just spin up multiple K3S clusters myself for my Istio or whatever development I want to do?
That's a good
what
question.
would be the advantage using vCluster versus I'm running K3S myself? Yes.
So we got the question actually a lot, and the funny thing is we are actually using K3S ourselves, so it's not too much different than spinning up K3S. However, like they're in like the basic idea is very different, since if you spin up a K3S, and K3S essentially is just a certified Kubernetes distribution where they packed all the different binaries into a single one. And what it's doing, it's spinning up a real Kubernetes cluster, similar to like what Kind, for example, is doing. And the difference here is that when you run K3S, you will also like install the kubelet, you will install a CNI plugin, you will essentially need a full VM to run this K3S, while with virtual cluster, you are reusing an already existing Kubernetes cluster to essentially separate it or partition it, if you want so, into different ones. So essentially you can think of it as like a virtual machine compared to a physical machine. So with K3S, you would create like different physical machines, while with virtual cluster, you would create virtual machines inside this different physical machines. So every K3S cluster you spin up would be also able to use or to house virtual clusters. The benefit of those compared to K3S is that it's much more lightweight, since we can strip out the whole kubelet. In K3S, it's actually called agent. We can strip out the whole agent logic. It's much more efficient, since we are essentially running K3S with 50% disabled and using another Kubernetes to schedule the workloads as well. The disadvantage of a virtual cluster compared to K3S is that, like, if you require hardware boundaries or hardware isolation, for example, on the networking side or on the workload side itself, then it might make sense to have like different physical clusters and not virtual clusters. But usually, so for example, for local development, it makes sense to use virtual clusters there as well, as it's much easier to run those than separate physical ones, which take much more memory and CPU and essentially computing resources in total.
Yeah, and then if you're in that scenario where your platform team gives you a namespace on a GKE cluster, that's the company development cluster, or an AWS, EKS cluster, something like that. Yeah, you wouldn't be able to spin up a K3S there, right? So that's
that's true. Yeah, so
I think that's the scenario where vCluster really, really shines. I think is when you've got a cluster that your platform team is provisioned and they've just given you access to like one namespace.
Yeah, makes sense. So that, as in summarize, I would capture is you only use 50% of K3S. So instead of the full-blown K3S, and in order for me to work with K3S directly, I would be working with virtual machine. With vCluster, I would just work with Kubernetes cluster and then use that to spin virtual cluster. So it could potentially be a lot easier because I don't have to worry about VMs. And some more lightweight, I guess the benefits comes with 50%, yes, and speed.
I just want to mention that here the picture that you can see now, it's my local environment. And as you can see, if I want to do something similar, I would need to use something like K3D, which is the multi-cluster version of K3S. And that brought me a lot of complexity that I didn't need. So this is why I found vCluster, because to solve that problem, I just needed some main cluster. In this case, as you can see here, it's a K3S. And within that K3S, I'm just spinning up vClusters, which at the same time are other K3S. I mean, that's why I wanted to this. I love it because this is like the I think that you guys mentioned it in some post or something. I also catch the idea. It was this movie Inception, the dream within a dream, and this is like a cluster within a cluster, and that is extremely good.
Yeah, we actually have a YouTube video where I create a virtual cluster. I think it was inside of a GKE cluster, and then I created another virtual cluster inside of that one. So you actually
wow.
could potentially have layers of them. There's not a real good use case for that, I think, besides the fact that it's just kind of funny to do.
It's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's I think, Antonio, you actually clarify an important point for me. Essentially, which I meant to ask, essentially you can run virtual cluster inside of K3S itself, right? Which I wasn't sure if I could. So that was interesting too.
Yeah, as you can see here, since I'm working with Mac, I need to have some Lima VM, which is provisioning the K3S, the main cluster. And after that point, I just keep it up and running. It's very lightweight, so I don't mean to lose it. But since I'm working, I'm just switching between other vClusters, switching totally the environment. Then in the demo, we will show it.
Yeah, I think we're ready to the demo. So whenever you're ready, and
the
audience, if you guys have any questions, please comment on the chat on the YouTube, and we'll bring your question up for our experts here to answer. Thank you.
All right. So I'm gonna start saying that the gods of the demos, they are not with me today. So this picture crashed right before the meeting, and I was like screaming out like, oh Jesus, oh Jesus. So I just use an AWS and EKS cluster, and the demo is going to run on EKS. We're going to spin up a vCluster on an EKS. But in general, this is the picture I use in local. To give a reference about how I work on a daily basis, we are like a team, a very nice team. Say hello to my team in EMEA. We are under Denny Janot, and well, he's driving us to give pre-sales. Pre-sales means that our users, they are coming to us with, hey, I have this crazy idea, and we just need to make it possible. Matching our products, which in this case is based on Istio and multi-cluster environments on Istio. Well, it's glue mesh, so it's everything about service mesh. So the picture is like that. Today I was working, here we go, and I've got we said that it's EKS. Can you see the screen? I believe so. Maybe I can zoom in it. The size is good. If nobody complains, we move forward. Yeah, seems like nobody complains. So let's move forward. Well, all right. So we've got the AKS. So let's check it out. And we are using K-Nights. Yeah. And what happened is like, I'm working today and I'm working in my vCluster. So let's list it. I'm using my vCluster list. So I'm working in Istio 1.14. So let's quickly, I just have here the commands. I've got my application because my user is really concerned about his Hello World application. So I'm sorry, since I was saying that I need to be in the Istio, in my Istio. Right now I'm moving to the other vCluster. So I'm working and I've got my user application is the Hello World. So if we go inside, we are, as you can see here, we are in this context. We see what is inside. And we've got a simple deployment of Istio with Hello World. As you can see, the picture is different. Here is the picture with my main cluster. Here is the picture within only the vCluster. So I'm going to keep this open just to have it as a reference. In a normal scenario, you don't care about the main cluster anymore. So what happened is like...
Can I ask a quick question here?
Yeah.
So on the left side, you have Istio Ingress Gateway, F5DC866 in the Istio 114 namespace. So I assume that's the same pods as your pods on the right side for the Istio Ingress Gateway in the Istio system namespace? Because your virtual cluster was created within Istio 114 namespace on the main cluster. Is that right?
Yeah. So as you can see here, when I deploy, then I will show you when I'm deploying a vCluster. When I'm deploying a vCluster, it's a stateful set, and a stateful set with their persistent volume, right? And this is actually the components to make the effect about I have another cluster. The stateful set is going to store all everything what should be in the etc, but it's just like a replica because in generally I'm using the resources from the main cluster. But me as a user of the vCluster, I don't see anything of this, right?
Yeah, one other thing too, Lin. So what vCluster does is when those pods get scheduled on the host cluster, on the underlying cluster, they get renamed. And so it appends both the name of the vCluster and the name of the namespace within the vCluster to the pod name. So that way you're never going to get collisions because you're never going to have more than one vCluster with the same name. Because, 5 different people, may want to install Istio and may end up with that same, pod name running. So that prevents collisions.
Exactly. So as you can see here, my hello world, me as a user, I've got my hello world, but the real flash, it's here. This is in the main cluster. What is the real pod happening in an isolation? So, well, I'm working, and suddenly my colleague comes up and say like, hey, Antonio, this user wants a proof of concept. So quickly, we need to deliver this. Oh, Jesus Christ, stress, multitasking. So, I mean, it's funny because, those monotask, I don't know who works like that. So I need to get back to the main one, and I'm gonna pause. This is one thing I really love by vCluster. It's like I'm gonna pause. What means is like I'm gonna scale down that stateful set, and also automatically all the resources that they are related to that stateful set, that vCluster are gonna be turned down. So not consumption anymore. I'm working in local, and I'm very concerned about the resources that I'm utilizing.
Yeah.
Here in this example, we're gonna run one vCluster, but there are gonna be installed like 5 Istios with 5 vClusters. So as you can see, I'm gonna be able to do this in local, not losing even one of the things. So my colleague,
let me just add one thing, Antonio. The pause thing is great, and that actually wasn't in the initial version of vCluster. That got added afterwards. And one thing that's been really great is the community around vCluster has been really active, and people have come up with a lot of great ideas. And so a lot of the things that we've added since the initial release have actually come from, user feedback from the community. So it's been really fun to see it grow.
All right. So next step, I'm going to spin up a vCluster, right? Let's do it. Let's see how fast it is. We're going to see here that sooner or later we will see a new pod. We'll show it there. Yes. My hood Istio test. This is the task I have to run right now. As you can see, already created. 15 seconds to have already an environment. I'm going to make sure that I don't have the context, so I'm going to delete it. I'm going to make sure that it's deleted because it's colliding. And I'm going to connect to that cluster.
This can easily... Oh, sorry, Antonio. I just want to mention one thing. When vCluster is creating the cluster inside that namespace on the host cluster, that's just a Helm command. And so the vCluster CLI does that for you if you do vCluster create, but you could also just use Helm, if like a sort of part of some GitOps workflow or something like that.
Yeah.
That's good to know.
So we connect. Actually, I'm going to pull the new kubeconfig, right, to connect to that vCluster. This can be done in one step. I'm just doing it in 2, just to show the capabilities. So now I have my own hood environment, Istio test, and if I do get ns, I see that I have like a fresh new cluster. If I click here, we switch the context. Let's get to K9s and move on, installing Istio. Install Istio. Yes, of course. This is the ECPC installation of Istio.
Yeah, while the Istio is being installed, we have one question from Shane. Thank you so much for that question. Is there any way to take a paused vCluster from one backing cluster and load it onto an entirely new backing cluster, like a snapshot?
Fabian, do you want to take that?
That's a good question. Yes and no. The problem, so what's certainly possible is essentially, since the state of the virtual cluster is saved by default, at least as an SQLite database on a persistent volume, you can just use like a backing or a backup solution like Velero, back up that namespace, and like essentially restore it in another Kubernetes cluster. Which is also why this usually, this works most of the time. However, there's some smaller limitations to this. For example, that naming references could be wrong inside the namespace, and like, for example, the persistent volumes also need to be backed up by Velero. But if you do this, then yes, it's possible to also kind of create a snapshot from a virtual cluster. However, it's not yet super easy to do that, but yeah, we are working on this to make eventually this hopefully happen, to create your own vCluster snapshots and easily switch those between different Kubernetes clusters.
Yeah, it really is a great question, and it's definitely something that people are interested in.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Shane, for that question. Antonio, back to you too for the demo.
I just keep going because it's too long. I'm just deploying my user's application, and I'm replicating his environment. And well, let's try if it works with my vCluster. And this is an HTTP bean application, the famous one. And yes, we can reach the application in this ephemeral vCluster. Now I don't need it anymore, the environment. So I'm gonna get back to my main cluster and delete this. I could pause it if I want to keep going then later, but I'm just gonna delete it because I don't need it anymore. I just try, test something, destroy it. Time that took me to spin up this cluster, barely nothing. So me being very focused on speeding up the development life cycle, it's very easy to me to just create things and destroy them, not wasting time. And well, time is really important, as you mentioned.
And I think that's a really big advantage for that local development kind of scenario. You know, even Lin, when you were talking about using K3s, I think it's going to be slower to like create and destroy those K3s clusters than it is to just have one cluster and create a bunch of virtual clusters inside of it.
Yeah, and also like the pause command, I think is also super useful and intuitive to use. By the way, we just got feedback from Shane. Thank you for that feedback, and thank you all for the answers for his question. So Antonio, back to you on the demo.
So I'm just resuming, whilst we are talking, resume. Yeah, I didn't spell it properly. So I finished this task quickly and getting back to my previous task, which was involved Istio 114. So as you can see now, it's coming up, and in a while we will be able to see again that hello application that I was working on. It's just now Ingress Gateway. Let's quickly check it.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Antonio, with your role, you know, being in that role where you're working with different customers and trying to duplicate their environments and all of that. It totally makes sense that vCluster would be really handy for you, you know.
So as you can see, the pods were created just now. Now I'm back to the Hello World application that I was working on previously. So yeah, that is the demo. I mean, it took me 5 minutes to really have the full power of a Kubernetes cluster, deploying Istio, testing out things about Istio, and then get back to my previous life.
Very cool. So I noticed you were using port forward command. Does virtual cluster support load balancer service type, or do I always have to use port forward?
So as you can see, this is, again, we are in the Istio 114, my previous task. And I'm deploying in AWS, so I'm going to have the host. I didn't want to use it because the load balancer sometimes take longer to spin up. So,
okay,
but
so it's
here in local,
it's
just immediately, because with MetalLB, I'm assigning a local IP, and that spins up pretty much fast. So
but yeah, you can have an ingress, Lin. There's we have documentation in the vCluster docs that walk people through how to set up that sort of stuff. So the port forwarding, I think, is really handy, just to get started really quickly. But if it's, more of a long-lived cluster that's going to be around, you definitely can set it up with ingress or something.
Very cool. Okay, so I guess if the audience and me are convinced, virtual cluster is really useful for single cluster, right? As Antonio, you showed us, you spin up an Istio cluster, you also spin up another test cluster. How does this work with multiple clusters? Because the reason why I'm asking is in Istio, in service mesh, multi-cluster is a very common topic where people want to connect their services across multiple cluster. I assume virtual cluster could potentially be set up in multiple cluster, and I can also test my services going through service mesh across multiple cluster.
So, well, I've got here the demo. It's gonna take a bit to spin up. As you can see, I was ready for your question. So I've got like a Istio in a multi-cluster shape. Let me just share. We have it here. This is, in my opinion, this is quite accurate, because usually in a production environment you have different networks. So the way you're going to have like multi-cluster, multi-mesh in different networks, this is going to be the deployment that you're going to use. And what happened in my two vClusters, it's in one I'm deploying this, and in the other one I'm deploying that. Maybe it's going to take a bit longer. That is better to have questions on things like that. But I just want to say that we proved it before, that we're going to use the external endpoint, the external IP. In AWS is the host name, and in Google is going to be an IP, in your local is going to be a plain IP. So to make the connection in a multi-cluster, you're going to use that IP or that host name, so that this service is going to connect to this gateway to perform the east-west traffic across the both clusters. So that is the way that even everything happening in a real cluster, the virtualization on top of vCluster makes the effect like, okay, they are in the same cluster, but they work like if they were totally isolated. So maybe I can go. Maybe it's not needed, but I've got here the two. So I got my context 1 and 2. And let's see if it's already up and running. We're going to connect to cluster 1. And we're going to connect to cluster 2. And that is the way that we are able easily. There is no brainer here, because, as I said, the communication is going to go through the external IP from the cluster. So the behavior is exactly like if they were totally different clusters, and works smoothly. I'm personally using this to test multi-cluster scenarios with Istio.
Yeah, it was really cool to see this. When this question came up, I didn't even know the answer to it, because you all are the Istio experts. But it's really neat to see that it works.
Yeah, totally. So just to help our audience, I think, Antonia, in your cluster, one of your cluster was running Hello version 1, and the other cluster was running on version 2. So the command you showed, it shows it was able to hit Hello version 1 in one of the cluster, and also Hello version 2 in the other cluster.
Yeah, I had to create the secret to move the config, the kube config from one cluster to another. So it's going to be able to make the communication. And well, basically that is how Istio multi-cluster deployment works. So
There
it's really nothing special.
Oh, sorry. There is an option in vCluster. There's a thing called isolated mode where it creates some network policies and extra things like that. And I'm assuming you don't have that on, right, Antonio? That
it's when I'm, as you can see here, I'm when you talk about these are you mentioned that you could install it through Helm. So the CLI is embedding Helm. So yeah, this is my configuration. As you can see, I'm using a K3s. Every single vCluster is a K3s. I'm faking the node. I'm not faking the nodes. I'm taking the real nodes. I could fake it easily. So even with one, for example, the classic standard deployment, 3 nodes could be in the virtual cluster simulating that I've got endless amount of nodes. And as you mentioned, the isolation feature, I don't use it here and I don't use the quota just because, and I'm privileged, as you can see, just because, well, I'm the owner of this. So
yeah, and I'm assuming that connectivity between the vClusters wouldn't probably work if the isolated mode was on. Does that sound right, Fabian? Do you think? Would it lock things down?
Yeah. I mean, like if the network policy is prohibiting this connections, then it won't work. Yes, but you could configure that probably.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, at the minimum, you would have to allow like the gateways onto Istio cluster to be able to communicate, because all the paths within both of the cluster, the communication like across cluster has to go through the gateway. So at the minimum, you have to make sure that's not blocked by network policy. So probably with more work, I guess it's possible.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Is there anything else that you have planned to show to us, Antonio? Or this is...
No, I mean, that is my, I just show you my daily basis.
Yeah, this is great. I mean, the stuff you mentioned about, set up the secrets across different Kubernetes cluster for Istio. That's what we do in GlueMesh to save user from setting that up, because we didn't believe it was the most secure way. So GlueMesh has a relay to help user to even simplify that. So with that, I would like to
just to mention, maybe there is thank you for the Loft guys, because they allow us to present a post, to write a post into their website, and there is the example that you just mentioned about GlueMesh multi-cluster with vCluster in your own local environment. So it's just, you can just go.
Do you want to paste that in the chat, that URL?
I don't have permissions to do it,
but let me find your blog. I can.
I mean, if you just go to loft.sh /blog, you'll see it. It's pretty high up on the list.
Given it's been just published. Yeah, I find it. No worries. I got it.
So, well, basically you can just follow, copy and paste commands, and it's gonna be working. There is one tricky thing. In your own local environment, when you deploy vClusters in the cloud, everything is easy, because it's, the IPs are really attached to the services, Kubernetes services. When you are working in local, probably it's good to mention, you can find here in fieldctl, you can find the resources where to run this in local, because what you're going to need is something called MetalLB. This is going to be that component in charge of attaching a local IP in order to be able to have the local experience. Because if you deploy this within a simple container, you need to always play with the network in order to make the connection between the host and the container, and back and forth, both directions.
I want to mention one more thing too, Lin. You'd asked earlier about how people could learn more, and I mentioned that at vCluster.com, there's those links to like the docs and the GitHub, but there's also a link there to a community Slack that we have that has a vCluster channel inside of it. And the maintainers are in there. There's other users who are using vClusters. So if you have questions and you want to talk to somebody, you know, after the call about it, that would be a great place to go. There also now is a vCluster channel in the Kubernetes Slack, the main Kubernetes community Slack, but it's very new. I don't think there's a lot of people in there, so you'll probably get more help if you go to our community Slack.
Okay, cool. This is great. Thank you so much for that demo, Antonia. I guess I have one last question I would like to get to before we wrap up, because we're almost out of time. So if I want to have my team have multiple namespaces, can I use virtual cluster as the boundary for more than one namespaces? What's your take on that? Let's say if my team, because one of the complaints we've heard from our user is, okay, namespace is a boundary within Kubernetes for tendency, but what if my tendency goes beyond one namespace? So I have 3 namespaces. Now, can I stand up a virtual cluster for those 3 namespaces? What's
absolutely.
Oh, Rich.
Sorry. Yeah, Fabian could answer this too. But this is one of the reasons why we created vCluster. I mean, it's really one of the use cases is that there are teams that need multiple namespaces, and then you end up with like network policies have to get adjusted to allow them to talk to each other, and there tend to be like a bunch of hoops that you have to jump through, and it can be really painful to maintain. And that's one of the great things about vCluster is that like inside the virtual cluster, you can create as many namespaces as you want.
Okay, so you still with one namespace.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So you still create a virtual cluster under one namespace. It's just going to be a bigger namespace, and then inside of that, you're using Kubernetes namespaces to manage.
You can have as many namespaces as you want inside the virtual cluster.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. Totally. Yeah. Okay, cool. I think this is it for this. I want to take a minute to thank you. Thank you, Antonio, for the wonderful demo. Thank you, Rich and Fabian, to bring your insights of vCluster. I feel like I've been educated about vCluster. You know, I'm eager to try for my next development environment or demo environment that I'm trying to set up now. So thank you so much for being willing to spend time to educate me and our audience about this topic.
Thank you for having us on. And yeah, Antonio, the demo was great. Thanks for putting that together. It was really fun to see.
Thank you,
guys.
For the blog
post. So much. Thank you so much. So folks, if you guys think this is interesting, we would really appreciate a thumbs up to our YouTube video. We would also appreciate a subscribe so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. And if you have any topics you would love to see related to Envoy, Istio, Kubernetes, eBPF, and GraphQL, please let us know, and we will try to find the right expert to talk about that. Thank you all for joining us.
I want to see eBPF stuff. Bring it on. I want to see that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we got a feedback from a couple of our audience. Thank you so much, Jorge. Awesome demo. We also got a feedback from Kim. Thank you for the enriching insights and demo. Thank you guys so much for the feedback. Really, really appreciate that. That's really what's get us going with these live streams. So really appreciate that. Thanks all for joining us today. Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.